Hey friends, Scott Sullivan here, Discipleship Catalyst with the Georgia Baptist Mission Board, and so excited to join you today. And the topic that we're going to be working through is dealing with men's ministry. So I'm working here with Ray Sullivan, our Southwest discipleship consultant in the state, just an absolute stud when it comes to men's ministry. He's done it, he's written about it, he's preached on it, he's seen results from that. And there are just some questions, Ray, that I've got about men's ministry. And we really want to help our people that are watching right now get to a place, because here's really an issue. If we don't solidify in our heart whether men's ministry is a valid ministry in the church, then we're never going to do it well. Right. So a lot of the churches, a lot of the leaders who are going to be watching us, they need to make a choice to reach men or not. And if you're going to do it, we got to do it really well. So Ray, I appreciate you joining us today, and we're so excited to have you on our team, you and your wife and your kids, and what you guys, and excited to for next blueberry season for you to bring me a big pile of blueberry from that blueberry farm that you live on. And I want to say a word to also, sometimes we forget to say, you and I are talking and engaging. Well, behind the scenes is PJ Dunn. So Dr. Dunn, you're not in the view here, but we appreciate you being the show producer for us today. And as always, just a reminder, we're able to do this because of the CP dollars that come in. So if you're a Georgia Baptist Church, let us just say thank you, because we do what we're able to do to resource and encourage you guys because you give to CP. So Ray, let's jump in here. And my first question for you, and let's kick this around because this is really important. Is men's ministry still relevant in today's church? And you and I've talked about this because this is a big deal. And there are people in our tribe that we love and that we respect that talk about large group and they talk about small group, and we've engaged in these D groups. But a lot of people are saying, there's not a place for women's ministry and men's ministry. They should just be in a small group, or they should just be in a Sunday school class. So help us out here. Why or is men's ministry still relevant to today's church?
Yeah, Scott, and really, I value that opinion. I mean, it makes a lot of sense that we want to get men and women involved in small groups, and we want to channel ministry through that. And so many times we only have, as a pastor, we only have so many resources, and we want to be effective and we want to be efficient in what we're using. So we start asking ourselves about all these other ministries that kind of exist, and do we just need to maybe not do this and focus on this? And sometimes, men's ministry is one of those that just kind of gets pushed to the wayside, or maybe we just put a $200 line item in the budget and say, well, if we decide to do something with men, we've got some money there. But I think the question, is it still relevant, depends upon what do you mean by when you're talking about men's ministry. Because as I drive around and I talk to different pastors and I ask this question, how's your men's ministry? What's going on with your men's ministry? A lot of times there's a definition of theirs. What is the men's ministry? And so if I ask that question, I'll get, well, we do a wild game banquet, once a year, or we do a get in the game Sunday in the fall. Or maybe a little bit more consistent, we have a brotherhood breakfast, every month. But that is the men's ministry. And so we're thinking about men's ministry in light of just activities or just events, not an intentional strategy to disciple the men in our church. And I like what Patrick Morley says about this. He says maybe we need to think of it in different terms and not call it men's ministry, but call it ministry to men. So it's all the things that we're doing in our church, whether that be evangelism or missions or helping men find their spiritual gift, getting them plugged into a small group, getting them connected with that small group of guys where there's mentoring and accountability and teaching them how to share their faith. All of those things that we do are part of the men's ministry, not just the event. So in light of that, is it still relevant in church today? Yeah, we need to reach men. Men are one of the largest neglected people groups in today's church. 13 million more adult women in church on any given Sunday than men. So yeah, we better get serious about it.
Absolutely. That's a good word, Ray. And it's huge. And one of the things that there's a gap here, because as a local church leader for the past 29 years, that's a part of my story is I'm working at the convention now, but I'm just now working at a convention. I've been in the local church in the trenches for 29 years. And for me, men's ministry was able to do some things that I wasn't really able to do well through the small group, through the life group. Because when you talk about, you know, and you're like talking my language, you talk about really most churches only exist to do the wild game banquet and to do that fish fry, or that sort of thing. That's really that was the extent of the men's ministry in a lot of churches. And we weren't moving them to a small group. We weren't trying to develop mentors for them. And what we found is there are a lot of those men that really are hungry for a mentor. They want to have some answers, man. They want that generation to reinvest in them. So, man, just a great word, great word, Ray. Well, let me give you a second question here. Why should I prioritize men's ministry in my church? Because there really are a lot, and as you and I and our team begins to talk about this watershed principle and these 6 main streams in the church that have to be healthy for the church to be healthy, man, this question of how and why to prioritize men's ministry is huge, because we got to start aligning things to make sure they're helping us to achieve the purpose of becoming a disciple-making church.
Yeah, I can give you a short answer. I'll give you 2 words. Jesus did.
Boom.
We can get real specific about it, but Jesus prioritized men. It's interesting when you study scripture and we see the things that Jesus did, and Jesus went to the synagogue and Jesus went to temple, we see that Jesus spends the majority of his time, most of his time, personally investing in 12 Jewish men, and specifically in 3, in Peter, James, and John. So Jesus' strategy of making disciples was to really personally invest and intentionally invest in men's ministry. So I think that's the short answer, but a couple of other things that I think we need to think about as pastors and leaders in our churches when it comes to prioritizing men's ministry is men's ministry, like you said, it gives us an opportunity to do some things sometimes that we don't necessarily get to do in our other groups. A lot of times our groups are age segmented, and it's hard to get the young guys with the old guys, and as a pastor for 29 years, that's what I always struggle with. The older guys felt like the younger guys didn't care about them, the younger guys felt like the older guys didn't care about them. And men's ministry is a wonderful opportunity to bridge that generational gap, to get those guys in fact, Scott, it's biblical. Titus tells us that the older men need to be pouring into younger men. Psalm 78 tells us that the generations, that we need to pass down those stories. And so getting those people involved in men's ministry, it's not age segmented, it's guys of all ages. And I would just encourage, even bring your youth into those events with men's ministry. So it's a great thing in the church to bridge that generational gap, but it's also a great opportunity to build leadership in the church. When you're thinking about men's ministry, and as a pastor, you're thinking about leadership development, I think those 2 run hand in hand. And so mentoring is a tremendous opportunity that you mentioned a minute ago that we're just seeing that fall by the wayside. It's been a couple of generations, and so we're seeing the effects of that. But studies show us that mentoring, guys that are mentored by other people, are 130% more likely to take leadership positions. Mm-hmm. And so instead of sitting there in a church nominating committee meeting and saying, who can we get to serve in this capacity, having these younger guys come along in this men's ministry, being mentored by these older guys, more experienced guys, a great way to build that pipeline of leadership into your church that you may not get the opportunity to do just in the small group, but be more specific and intentional in the men's ministry.
And they can work together instead of being in men's ministry to the exclusion of small group. You want to get them in a small group, and then the men's ministry is what they're doing. They're working together. It's that cross pollination that's helping in both sections there. It's just really good. Now, let me take a minute here. Just if you're watching, we want to hear from you. So let me ask you this question. Who is that person? If anybody that's viewing today, if you've been mentored, if you had somebody who really invested in your life, like I could say my dad, I'm one of those blessed guys, man, that just has a dad that was an absolute Superman hero, did a lot of things well, and just, man, he intentionally invested in each of us as his 3 children. But I also had, at certain points, a basketball coach that loved Jesus and just looked me in the eye, kept me accountable, loved me well, but also kept me accountable, had said some hard things to me. So if you're viewing, let us know who that was a mentor to you, but share in one or two sentences what they did that made a difference in your life. That'd be great. We'd love to hear that in the comments. So now as we go to this third question here, Ray, let's talk about intentional. Okay, that's a big word that we work on our team. When we talk about developing a strategy, we say we want it to be an intentional strategy and a customizable strategy for each local church. So what does an intentional ministry to men look like in today's church?
Yeah, Scott, and I think that's a great word. And as we talk more about the watershed principle that'll be coming out this fall with our team, we'll talk a lot more about this. And it's not that we're always trying to recreate new things in the church. And a lot of times pastors feel overwhelmed because if you start talking about men's ministry, say, well, what do I have to do? How do I organize that? It's something else on my calendar and on my plate. But what we're talking about here is just a balanced approach to ministering to the men in your church. And so we just talked about it when we talked about bridging the generational gap. Your small groups and your men's ministry work together in that. And I think it's the same thing. It's thinking, I used to struggle with this where, if you didn't go to the brotherhood breakfast, you weren't part of the men's ministry. And if you're a young guy and you got kids, I can't, Saturday morning, I can't go to the brotherhood breakfast, right? I can't go at a certain time. So I'm not part of the men's ministry. Well, if you don't build handicap ramps, I had a guy in one of my churches and loved him to death. And I mean, that was his heart and that was his passion. And man, he was good at it. And he literally built hundreds of ramps with guys, but it kind of got to be, that's what the men's ministry was. And if you didn't build handicap ramps, you weren't part of the men's ministry. And so you begin to ask the question, what about the guy that's leading worship on Sunday? What about the guy that's on the worship team? What about the guy that's working with Awana or Team Kid? The guy that's working. So getting out of the mindset of thinking that our men's ministry is just getting involved in one or two things. The goal is this, is the goal to get guys to come, or is the goal to disciple men? And so balanced is looking at all of the things that we're doing in our church and how do we involve men in those activities, and how do we channel that into that, making that disciple who becomes a disciple maker. So I think that's the big key when we think about balance. It's not just one activity. It's not just one thing in the budget. It's not just one monthly brotherhood breakfast. It involves all that we're doing in the church, everything that men are involved with. So your men's leadership team, your men's pastor, or just your lay leadership team is thinking all the time, what are our men involved in the church, and how do we take advantage of that and bring all that together to make disciples? So I think that's being intentional rather than just saying, well, we hope they come and we write them down on our ACP as this is how many we had in a men's activity.
Yeah. And let me give you an example of what I saw in the last church that I was in. He was our music minister. His name was Scotty, and he was in one of these journey groups, which is D group, discipleship group. 4 guys, closed group. So I was talking to his life group leader, which is Sunday school, same Sunday morning type of deal, Sunday morning. I was talking to her and she said, listen, whatever you guys are doing in those journey groups, man, it's really making a difference because the discussions that Scotty's having are so much deeper and full and richer in our life group than it was before he was in that journey group. And what it spoke to me was he's diving deeper. He's engaging more intimately with the scriptures, but there's transformation beginning to happen. So it's not that they were separate. Those things work together. They're building together. And man, what you're saying just totally makes sense.
Just fleshing out. And let me add this too, and this is something we've talked about before too. A lot of times when we think about men's ministry, we're just thinking about families. How do we get the husband? How do we get the dad? Here's something to think about. 40% of our men in our culture today, in our society today, are single.
That's right.
So how do you utilize your men's ministry to reach those single men? Because we're seeing this day, guys are getting married later and later and later. I think Dr. P.J. Dunn, our single specialist, told us the other day, 30%, I think it's like 30 years old, something like that, before the average age of a first-time marriage. So if you're just thinking about men's ministry involved in how do we get the older guys and how we get the married guys, man, you're missing 40% of the population out there. So what is your singles ministry doing for men? What is your men's ministry doing for singles?
Oh, Ray, I'm so glad you brought that in because I'm telling you, when we talk about intentional ministry, you can't check that box. You can't say that you're doing men's ministry well if you're not doing something to target the single men in your congregation. I'm just telling you, that is a huge untapped resource that I guarantee you will provide fruit. Now, let me give a caution at this point, Ray, because one struggle that I see in the church when we talk about this intentional ministry, and we talked about this, we do the wild game banquet and we do the breakfast and we have the big buck contests and we get people and we give the gospel and we might even see people saved, but we're not. The struggle is we've got to find a way. If you're going to be intentional about your ministry, you've got to find a way to move them from that event into some kind of smaller group. So for me, I would love men's ministry to look like, man, have that big buck contest. There are rednecks around you. They're going to come to that. They won't come to anything else. I saw it every year for 29 years. So I'm an advocate for those events. But you got to build something in. As the number one thing you do when it's over is follow up.
Yeah.
Within 24 hours, you've already got a team set that you're going out, you're visiting those guys, you're sharing with them, helping them to get connected, and then trying to bring some respected other men, maybe businessmen, that they would respect or guys that they know, and then try to immediately get them connected into some kind of small group that's non-threatening, where they don't have to know all the Bible before they get in there, but that's intentional ministry. And that's the kind of stuff that'll make a difference.
And that's the struggle that I've seen. That I had that struggle as a pastor. That's one of the things that I used to wrestle with. We had great attendance at wild game banquets and those things that we did for men, and we saw people come to faith in Christ. And it's just easy to look at that and say, man, that was a success. That was great. And it was successful, in context of what it did, but was that producing disciples? And so really being intentional about that follow-up and thinking about the things that we already have going on in the church, and how do we plug those guys into those things that are already going on. Those are those things that we just think about in planning, and we need to be more intentional on the follow-up. The goal is not to draw a crowd of men. The goal is not to get men in church. The goal is to make disciples.
That's it.
And so that's got to be what we're thinking down the road.
Yeah. If you're not seeing a life change and you can't tell that they're moving towards spiritual maturity, then we got to change something.
Yep.
Like my quote on that, Ray, is you can't be married to anything but your spouse. If it ain't working, you got to be willing to change it. Your spouse ain't one of them. You got to keep him or her, but everything else you got to be willing to shift and make.
And in the midst of that, we do have an opportunity right now with COVID. We've seen where some of these walls are kind of coming down, and we can rethink, how we're doing things, and are we being intentional, and some of the things that we thought we never could maybe move away from. Now we have a little bit more flexibility. So I just challenge our pastors, I challenge the guys that are watching, think about those men in your church and think about those men in your community. And if we can't get together right now in big groups, it's interesting to me as we talk week in and week out, that it seems as though the one thing we're trying to do more than anything else is get our people back on Sunday morning. And I can say this, Scott, because I've been a pastor for 29 years. I'm a preacher. I love to preach, and preaching is God ordained. Preaching is of God, and there's power in preaching. But there are other things that we can do. And I think, that to make disciples, God forbid we ever lose that platform and we lose that Sunday morning hour where we can preach. But truthfully, that's happened all over the world, yet other places are still making disciples. And so, if we don't have that platform, if we don't have that time, can I still go and make disciples? And so I'm curious of how many guys, and this would be a great thing for people to comment on, how many of you are thinking a little bit outside of just the Sunday morning experience right now? If this thing goes longer with COVID, if it goes, longer into next year, what are some ways that you are still actively and intentionally making disciples that are maybe outside of the Sunday morning hour? And your men's ministry, your ministry to men is a great place to start.
That's right. So leave that and put that in a comment. What are some things that you're doing to intentionally try to reach men? We want to hear that from you, but this is also good. We are networking together. We are gaining best practices, and typically we're average about 1,000 views on these broadcasts. So you got a lot of other people that are watching. So if you're doing something, please comment below so we can all benefit from that. Now, Ray, let me give you one last question here. Why is discipling men one of the best ways to fulfill the Great Commission?
Yeah, so the blog that was posted on the website this week on our Georgia Baptist discipleship page, that was pretty much the title, is discipling men is one of the best ways to fulfill the Great Commission. Now, understanding, we talked about this earlier, that 40% of our men are single. A lot of times, most of us have heard the statistic, and the numbers vary a little bit, but I think it's pretty accurate, that we need to be intentional about reaching men, because 93% of the time, if we reach the man of a family, 93% of the time, the family follows. Compare that to 17% of the time of reaching the mother. Now, when we stop, Scott, and we look at our churches, and let's just say, if you want to know what a church's priorities are, look at the budget, right? If you look at the budget, right, you say, well, okay, if 93% of the time, if we reach dad, if we reach the man, we get the rest of the family. Why is it that our men's ministry is usually some little tag thing down at the very end, and we're putting so much more resource, whether it be money or time or energy, into other areas of the ministry? So, if you want to be obedient and faithful and say, I want to fulfill the Great Commission, I want to go and make disciples, then I would just challenge you, begin to think and be very intentional and serious about, how can I reach the men in my community? And so another statistic that was in that article that just blew me away is there are some 90 million men in America today that are not being discipled.
That's good.
You talking about the fields are white with harvest. There's 90 million men out there that are not being discipled. And so if we just begin to say, God, who are the 2 or 3 you got around me, and begin to pour into those guys, the likelihood is that those are going to repeat, and those disciples are going to make disciples, and we're going to be faithful in the Great Commission. And I like most of our guys listen today, I want to hear, well done, good and faithful servant.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a Christian out there that doesn't want to hear that. But I also ask the question, what's going to be the standard that Jesus is going to judge that on? And Jesus told us, go make disciples. And so I think there's going to be a tie in there with, well done, good and faithful servant, if I have been faithful in doing what he's called me to do and make disciples. And so
we got to give our men, we got to give them a chance. We got to give them a fighting chance, Ray.
Got to go get them.
In our churches, we can't look at, the biggest reprobates and just count those guys off. I wrote a chapter in the book, Together We Equip, with some seminary friends, and the chapter was on men's ministry, and they talk about Jim. And he was just a hellion, man. He did everything wrong. He was in jail. He was a partier, and a pastor comes to jail, leads him to the Lord, but he didn't leave him alone. He gave him chance after chance. He kept coming back for like 6 months, sharing the gospel, teaching him. Once he got saved, discipling him, he gets out. And then when I left Houghton, Jim was arguably the best Bible teacher in the church at, wow, I don't know, 70 years old or something. Yeah. But you'd never know that. But he got a second chance and a third chance, and we got to give our men a chance. So whatever you're doing, figure out who you are as a church. Figure out how you're going to try to reach men, and then be very good at what you do. But it can't be just the big event. We got to get those into those smaller groups where people can invest, and it's long-term investment, and it also involves multiplication. Ray Sullivan, you are stud. Thank you for being on here with us today. Thank you for helping with this discussion. And as always, if you're viewing today, make sure you leave a comment. We're going to give free swag away. Pull it from somebody that leaves a comment. And we appreciate you engaging, and we pray that you'll continue to reinvest the gospel seed that was shared with you with someone else. It's the only way we're going to reach the world. So for Georgia Baptist Discipleship, we love and appreciate and honor to do what we do. And we look forward to visiting with you again next week with another broadcast, Thursdays at 3. See ya.